I'm Hannah.
I'm Sruti.
And welcome to RedHanded. This has bumped David Parker Ray off my most ungettable outable of my brainable.
Wow.
Yes.
I never thought I'd see the day.
Me either.
Wow.
But it has happened. The time has come.
Well, I'm here for it, kind of.
I wish I was.
Well, strap in, because you might be feeling the same by the end of this episode. But it's a two-parter.
1849 Caroline Street in Canton, Ohio stood silent. And whatever walked there, walked alone. That's the opening of Hill House. I'm sorry, I stole it. I couldn't resist. Once, the 9-room structure had been filled with children, but by 1994, those days were gone. Only their worldly belongings remained. The Stark County Sheriff's Office put the house up for auction. The previous owner owed a lot of people a lot of money, and selling the house seemed like the only way to make a dent in his debts. Getting someone to take the house wouldn't be easy, though. It was dilapidated and full of shit. But that wasn't the reason no one wanted anything to do with it. If you walked up to the front door of 1849 Caroline, you would be met with a statue of Jesus, holding his arms out towards you. There's nothing unusual about that. Lots of Christ sculptures are in that position. But this Jesus statue has no hands.
Take it down if you want to sell your house. Come on. What was that TV show where that woman would just go around your house and be like, paint everything magnolia, bake some bread, and you'll sell your house? Also, take down the fucking creepy Jesus statue with no hands.
The front door of the house had a metal cross on it, which read, "Peace to all those who enter here."
Don't believe it.
The handless Jesus had once belonged to the homeowner's mother, but nobody knows when it lost its hands. Everyone in Canton knew that there was absolutely no peace in that house.
The deeds to this house were held by a man called Lee Sexton. He and his wife were on the FBI's most wanted list. Despite that and all the whispers that swirled around the Sexton house, the sheriff's office did actually manage to sell it. The couple who bought it knew the Sexton family, who had occupied the house on Caroline Street for 15 years. Lee Sexton was a polite man, fond of a good deal, and he would often take his sons with him when he was striking these deals. The Sexton children, all 12 of them, were very obedient. Sexton's nickname about town was the bellhop because of how quickly his brood jumped up to carry out his commands. And we'll meet all of them over the course of this episode. Like we said, it's a two-parter. But it does get confusing, so maybe just write all their names down or something.
As the house was cleared out, it became very clear to the buyers that Lee Sexton had a secret. Every internal door in the house had a broken lock. All of the doors had been kicked in. All but one of the bedrooms had trapdoors in the walls. And if you opened them, you'd see little nests of blankets and children's toys, as if the 12 children who lived in that house had needed somewhere to hide.
Can you include that on the square footage of your house floor plan?
What, human nest?
Yes, I don't know.
In the basement was a wheelchair, a hospital bed, and a mattress covered in crude drawings of erect penises and vulvas, quite clearly sketched by children. 2 chains hung from the rafters, and a bundle of greeting cards lay on the ground. They were all from the Sexton children addressed to their parents, filled with messages of how much they loved them.
Everyone in Canton knew that the Sexton children were odd, but as long as they had lived at 1849 Caroline Street, no one had managed to expose the patriarch's secret. But we have found it for you, and as that description of the house that Hannah just gave you might suggest, it is horrifying. So please strap in, and after you listen to this, probably just be nice to yourself. Now, before we go on, there are a lot of people in this story, and to make things even more confusing, all of the children had nicknames, and some of them also have the same name, so keeping up with it is probably going to be a bit of a nightmare. So to make things easier, we're going to pick one name for each person and stick with it for the rest of the episode.
Yeah, so if you go around and read about this case, you might see people being described using different names. There are also stages in the story where pseudonyms are used, and there is a book about this case which is called House of Secrets. I would recommend using that as your source because of the state laws in Ohio. A lot of the stuff that's in the press is either the children's names are recanted or they're fake ones, and it gets so confusing. But we're going to try our best. Here are the 12. We've got Patrick, Eddie Jr., Pixie, Willie, Sherry, Michelle, Charles, James, Matthew, Christopher, Lana, and Kimberly. The oldest one, Patrick, was 24 when the house was sold, and Kimberly was 7. The maximum age difference between any of the Sexton kids was just over 2 years. I think all of the first 4 are only a year apart. First off, let's meet the eldest Sexton girl, Pixie. She was actually called Estella, but so was her mum, so we'll stick to Pixie. At school, the Sexton children kept to themselves. Their father would only allow them to have one friend, and no one was ever allowed back to the house on Caroline Street. High schooler Terry Turify attempted to befriend Pixie Sexton in their junior year. She felt sorry for the lonely-looking girl with odd-looking clothes and greasy hair. But Terry didn't really get very far. Pixie wasn't allowed to go to the mall or even the cinema. Every time Terry invited her to something, the answer Pixie gave was always the same. My dad won't like it.
Through the summer holidays, Pixie and Terry didn't see each other at all. When they returned to school for their senior year, there was something different about Pixie Sexton. The painfully shy girl who wasn't allowed to go anywhere or do anything was pregnant. Terry was totally bamboozled and couldn't stop herself from asking Pixie who the daddy was. Pixie calmly told her that the father of her unborn child had run off and joined the Navy. She added that her parents were really happy for her, though, which directly contradicted everything that Terry knew about the super strict Sextons. Pixie was adamant. As long as she was happy, so were her parents.
Pixie was far from the only outsider at that school. Joel Good was another. A quiet boy with a low IQ. He just kept his head down and got on with it. His parents had died a few years before, and since then Joel had lived with his Auntie Teresa and washed dishes at the weekend for spending money. Parents liked him. He was polite, and with his low grade point average, there was no way he was going to college. All Joel Good really wanted was to have a family. With prom fast approaching, Terry put her matchmaking hat on and suggested to Joel that he ask Pixie Sexton to be his date. An introduction that Terry Turify would regret for as long as she lived. Auntie Teresa took Joel to the Sexton house on Caroline Street on the night of the big dance. In the great American tradition, her nervous nephew had bought a corsage for the pregnant Pixie. Pixie actually scrubbed up all right, but she didn't pin the red rose from Joel to her powder blue dress. She already had a corsage tied to her wrist that her father had given her.
Joel struggled at the prom. It was not the high school photo finish that he wanted. Pixie barely spoke to him and refused to hold his hand. Her dad and one of her brothers picked her up as darkness fell, and Joel didn't see Pixie again for weeks. Eventually, though, he resolved to try again, and after Pixie had her baby girl, Joel took himself back to the Sexton house to give it another shot. Baby Dawn looked just like her mother, and Joel was great with Dawn, and Eddie Lee Sexton was very encouraging of Pixie's budding relationship.
This is an interesting thing to note. The only time Eddie Lee Sexton is encouraging of spending time with outsiders is there comes a point in all of his teenage daughters' lives where he's like, okay, now you can have a boyfriend.
So Joel, with the permission and approval of Pixie's father, started to go and hang out with her and baby Dawn a few nights a week for the rest of the summer. Soon enough, even though he could never get a straight answer out of Pixie regarding who Dawn's father actually was, Joel Good fell head over heels in love with Pixie Sexton.
When September rolled around, Joel announced to his Auntie Teresa that the Sextons were all moving to Montana to live on a big ranch, and he was going with them. That didn't happen. Teresa was overwhelmed with relief. She'd always had a bad feeling about Pixie, and she was worried that her sweet nephew was being manipulated, but she just couldn't figure out to what end. Soon after the Montana announcement, out of the blue, Pixie dumped Joel. As usual, she did not give him a real reason, but there was one.
In November 1990, Pixie and Dawn were back in Joel's life, and so was another bundle of joy. Pixie had had another baby girl, called Shasta. The Sextons had never gone to Montana, and Pixie wheeled out the Navy boyfriend baby explanation again, saying that they had a one-night stand, and then he left. Again. Joel's family saw a marked change in Joel the longer he spent around that Sexton girl. He was scraggly, his hair was too long, and if you asked him a question, he would look at Pixie as if asking permission to answer. Before long, Joel was also living at the Caroline Street house with all of the other Sextons.
It's because most of the boys are older, right? And the boys are allowed to leave when they're 18. Most of them are married, apart from Willie, but I'll come on to that later. So, kind of at no point in our story are all of them living there, but there's so many people in that fucking house. In January 1992, Joel called his Aunt Teresa to tell her that Pixie was pregnant for a third time and he was going to marry her on the upcoming Valentine's Day. Teresa and other members of the Good family sat around waiting for invitations or literally any scrap of information on Joel's impending nuptials. But they never came. Joel rang them again on the 12th of February, which is 2 days before Valentine's Day, if you need that clearing up for you. And he said that the wedding had already happened. That day, in fact. Eddie Lee Sexton had officiated the ceremony in his own living room. And Joel had some other, less celebratory news as well. Pixie had miscarried. Teresa asked Joel if Pixie had been to see a doctor. Joel said that she hadn't. And Teresa was pretty sure that there never was a pregnancy. Which made her wonder why Pixie Sexton would have married Joel in such a hurry if there was no baby at all.
Pixie may have had her reasons, but it was her father, Eddie Lee Sexton, who was really pulling all the matrimonial strings. Because he needed a get-out-of-jail-free card. Because a condition of the marriage was that Joel Good legally was to be registered as the father of both baby Dawn and baby Shasta.
Earlier, on the day that would become the wedding day, the Sextons had a visit from a police officer, a social worker, and one of the Sexton girls, Michelle. Michelle was being escorted to the property to collect some of her clothes before being checked into a women's shelter. And as the trio walked into the house, Eddie Lee Sexton was sat in a wheelchair in his kitchen. He said that there had been an enormous misunderstanding. He asked Michelle, his 18-year-old daughter, in a very calm, velvety voice, "Did I hit you?" Michelle didn't answer him, but she didn't need to. Social worker Wayne Welsh had been on the job a long time. He had many reports filed on the Sextons, the first one dating back to 1979, but there was never enough to take things further. Over his career, Welsh had learned that neglect has a smell, and 1849 Caroline Street was covered in it.
Earlier that day, Michelle had sat in her school counsellor's office convinced that she was pregnant. The counsellor called social worker Wayne Welsh in to interview her, and Wayne Welsh was not surprised. He had already been to the school to speak to various Sexton kids before. In 1989, Sherry Sexton told the counsellor that she had been beaten with a belt and that she had large red welts on the back of her legs to prove it. Then Willie Sexton had been accused of starting fires. And then there were a long list of referrals to the Department of Health, hospital visits, hygiene concerns, and sexual behaviour towards other children. But crucially, for any action to be taken, the DHS needed the children to disclose what was going on. If the kids didn't talk, Wayne Welsh couldn't help. And like we said, he's been here before, so he expected the same thing to happen that day in 1991 with Michelle. But he was wrong. Michelle Sexton had had enough, and she was ready to talk.
Michelle had been pushed over the edge by what had happened to her in the Caroline Street house. Wayne Welsh listened as the 18-year-old whispered a litany of horrors. Not only were the Sexton kids not allowed to do anything, Eddie Lee Sexton would give each of them a quarter before they left for school in the morning. If they saw any of their siblings breaking any of the rules, they had to go to a phone box and use that quarter to call him and knock. The only way was Dad's way. And then came the bombshell. Michelle was pregnant. And the only person she had ever had any kind of sexual contact with was her own father.
Yep, it's one of those cases.
The previous December, Eddie Lee Sexton took Michelle out with him for a drive. He said he wanted to talk about her future, and Michelle dared to hope that her father was going to let her go to college. Sexton had absolutely no intention of talking about Michelle getting a degree. He parked his van in a pitch-black car park and slapped his daughter across the face. Then he dragged her into the back of the van and raped her. His handprints were bruised into her arms. And when he was finished, he told Michelle, "Say anything to anybody and I'll kill you." It would be very easy. Girls go missing every day. And then Michelle's father took her to a gas station toilet and told her to clean herself up.
Michelle missed her next period. She told social worker Wayne Welsh that Sexton somehow knew this and would do impressions of a pregnant woman waddling around the house. A few weeks later, Eddie Sexton kicked Michelle in the stomach. Sherry, one of her sisters, had been pregnant the year before too, and that baby was kicked out of her by her brother James. Michelle told Welsh, "I'm pregnant and they're trying to kill my baby." Michelle thought that the father had raped her to punish Michelle for seeing something she shouldn't have. She had looked through the garage window one day and saw her father and her older brother Eddie Jr. next to a bloody body in a car boot. Eddie Lee Sexton made a point of telling his children that he knew a lot of dangerous people who could make them disappear in an instant. He even had a favourite one, known only as the Iceman.
If Michelle was telling the truth, that would mean that 4 conceptions had happened within the Sexton siblings in as many years, and only Pixie Sexton's children, Dawn and Shasta, were allowed to be born.
Why do you think he kills the other pregnancies before they can go to term?
You'll find out.
Oh, good. Right, never mind.
When Michelle was asked why she was only coming forward for help now, she said that she'd seen her father kiss her 2 youngest sisters, who are 7 and 9, by the way, on the lips before they left for school, and she couldn't let them go through the same thing that she and Sherry had.
What are your thoughts on parents kissing their children on the lips?
I think it's gross.
I agree.
It makes me feel really uncomfortable.
I agree. If you're also raping them behind closed doors, even worse. But even if you're not, there's something weird about it.
I don't like it.
Don't like it. There's so many other parts of the face you can kiss. Don't kiss them on the lips.
No, I unsubscribe.
No.
There was another reason why it took quite a while for Michelle to pluck up the courage to come forward. She was convinced that if she told anyone what her father was doing, he would go to prison, and that the family wouldn't be able to go on without him, which is obviously a belief that he has instilled in her through years upon years upon years of abuse. As Wayne Welsh took in Michelle's story, he couldn't stop thinking about cults. And not to get all Year 9 essay about it, but the definition of a cult is a group requiring unwavering devotion to a set of beliefs or practices that are considered by most people to be deviant. And cults also have an undisputed leader that no one disobeys because the consequences are too terrifying. And cult leaders always have a deep, dark secret that they are hiding. 1849 Caroline Street wasn't a house. It was a compound.
When Michelle was finished with her story, Wayne Welsh told her that she was not going home. He was going to put her into a woman's shelter. He also recommended that they take a trip to the police station to make a proper statement. The police, just like Welsh, wouldn't be surprised. They also had a list of Sexton scandals as long as your arm. including fires, thefts, violence, fraud, vandalism, burglary. But just like the DHS, the police never had enough to actually pin anything on the Sextons. Now, when mention of police came up, Michelle refused to go. She said she was too scared. So Wayne Welsh, accompanied by a police officer, took Michelle to get her clothes from Caroline Street. And after they left, Eddie Lee Sexton decided to bring the marriage of Pixie and Joel up by a couple of days. Wayne Welsh had shaken him. Like all cult leaders, Eddie Lee Sexton had a secret, and Michelle was now out of his control. Michelle ended up in a Christian shepherding program that found foster homes for pregnant teens with nowhere to go. It was run by a woman called Anne Green, a jolly lady, firmly in the higher the hair, the closer to God camp.
I love Anne Green. I love her so much.
But Michelle was not an easy charge for Anne. Once she was housed, she broke curfews and was tricky to deal with. She would also have night terrors, and her foster families would find her sleeping under her bed or in a cupboard.
Then it turned out that Michelle wasn't pregnant at all. Anne Green asked her why she thought she was, and after a long silence, Michelle Sexton whispered, "My dad raped me." Anne, appalled obviously, remained calm and told Michelle that she had to report it to the police, but again, Michelle just couldn't. Her dad had people everywhere, and he would tell his children repeatedly, "A good snitch is a dead snitch." That's what he does. He does the same things over and over and over again. He has these catchphrases that he uses like on a loop, and his kids like parrot them.
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen time and time again with cult leaders how they're able to completely take over the brain's thinking processes, even destroy people's personalities so many times on this show. And even if you look at cases like Colleen Stan, where she's abducted by that man and then he manipulates her into believing that she ever runs away or ever leaves or ever tells anybody about what's going on with her, that this mysterious organization that's out there that he is a part of will kill her or do something far worse to her than he's doing. And that kind of manipulation is able to happen within months, within a few years, like with Colleen Stan, to the point that she's going out for runs and not asking for help. These are his own children. Is there a more powerful dynamic that you could have that would make this kind of brainwashing easier? Absolutely not. We see it happen with people who are complete strangers.
Mm-hmm. And he pulls it off, if you include Estella, his wife, which I'll talk about next week. I don't know how much I believe that, but he pulls it off at least 14 times. At the very least. As tragic as Michelle's tale was, the negative pregnancy test meant that Michelle Sexton was actually no longer eligible for Anne Green's program. But Anne wasn't going to let Michelle down like everybody else had. Anne went to the police herself, and she moved Michelle into a safe house. Eventually, Michelle agreed to speak to a police officer, and the man on the job was Sergeant Glyn Go. A pause. We have Wayne Welsh and Glyn Go.
I know. There's a lot of, very fake-sounding names in this story. Mm-hmm. It sounds like Inspector Gadget's, actual name.
Yes, yeah.
Now, like everyone else we've met so far, Glyn Go was well aware of the weird family that lived in the weird house with the amputee Jesus statue. A terrified Michelle sat in his office and started to talk. She began with the family tree, adding in all the nicknames that her father had given all of her siblings.
It happens a lot in Sexton interviews where they'll start and then the social worker or the policeman or the solicitor sometimes has to be like, whoa, 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 whoa. Before you start, you need to lay out who everyone is because it is so confusing.
Absolutely. So some of these nicknames that Eddie Lee Sexton had given his children were nice, like Bunny or Bird or Skipper. When she was younger, her father had called Michelle Candy. But when she strayed from the path, he had a new one for her. Diarrhea Mouth. Dawn and Shasta, though they were just babies, had nicknames too. Michelle said, and almost as a throwaway she added, Pixie's children are Dad's children. Everyone knows. We just know. Then Michelle moved on to the discipline inside the house. Up until the age of 16, children would be beaten with sticks. They would have to go out into the front garden, and choose the stick that would be used. They would then be taken into the master bedroom, where Eddie Lee Sexton would beat their naked bodies, and their mother Estella would watch. Once they were over 16, they no longer got the stick, they got the fist. And their mother Estella wouldn't always just watch. Once she beat one of the Sexton boys herself 49 times. And it wasn't all just physical beatings. There were psychological punishments too. Once Michelle was locked in a cupboard by her father, and he sprayed boot spray under the door until she passed out. I'd still say that's pretty physical, but yeah, there's a lot going on. I think being made to live in a house that's full of shit is pretty up there on the psychological abuse side of things also.
I mean, it kind of goes through phases. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't.
Yeah.
On Friday nights, the female siblings were ordered to dance for hours on end, and their father would give them instructions on how to move. And, as I implied earlier, when his daughters got pregnant, Sexton would allow them to find a boyfriend, and he would spend a lot of time with said boyfriend, grooming them into the family. Joel Good was not the first. Michelle was more together in this second interview than she had been at the school, and she was more open to questioning. Glingo asked her how she knew that her father was raping her sisters. She said that she'd seen it. One night she'd pretended to sleepwalk and saw her father and Pixie together. It's so hard to use the right words because a lot of it is, I mean, it is incest ever conceptual, but after Pixie's 18, she is an adult. And a lot of the interviews are like, have sex with, had sex with, blah, blah, blah. It's difficult to know. But she says, I saw them having sex. I saw Pixie and my dad, who is also her dad, having sex. I saw it. One night, Eddie Lee Sexton took Sherry out for a drive, and when they returned, her father's flies were open and his shirt was hanging out.
After this interview, Michelle bounced from safe house to shelter to friends' houses, and eventually ended up in a psych ward after a suicide attempt. From the ward, she called her father's brother, Otis. He was a preacher and also lived in Canton, Ohio, but he hadn't spoken to his brother Eddie for over a year. Despite this, Otis went and got Michelle, and when she told him what had happened, he said, "Honey, I'm going to be honest with you. I've been suspecting it for years." Very casual.
But this is the thing that we'll find out, like, whatever happened to Eddie Lee Sexton to make him the way he is, his brothers have also not had perfect upbringings. So expecting them to act like normal people is probably a bit of a fool's errand.
So after he came and got her, at Michelle's request, Otis, who all of the Sexton kids called Uncle Oti, phoned Wayne Welsh. Welsh came to Otis's home to interview Michelle again, and this time she had even more to give. The dark night in the van was not the first time her father had sexually abused her. When she was 12, he had tried to rape her, but in her words, she was too small.
Wayne Welsh knew that he had to get those kids out of that house, but the only evidence he had was Michelle's story and a gut feeling. But he listened to it anyway. That very same day, Lana and Kimberly Sexton were taken from school by the DHS, and so was Charles. Christopher and James were removed from the Sexton house itself. They hadn't gone to school that day. As they were taken away, Eddie Lee Sexton and his wife Estella stood on the deck outside. Sexton said the same thing that he had said when Michelle came to collect her clothes. This is all a big misunderstanding. Estella was less collected. She shouted in front of all of their neighbours, "He doesn't molest anybody."
Good one, Estella.
Yeah. No one asked you. With all of the minor Sextons in state custody, the DHS had 30 days to get a case in front of a judge, or those kids would have to be returned to that house. The race was on.
The next day, the 17th of April 1991, Sexton applied for a court order forbidding his brother Otis, Uncle Oti, from having any contact with his underage children. Sexton's narrative was that this was all Otis's doing, and he didn't want his twisted brother influencing his children. Sexton argued that Otis was the one who had been feeding Michelle lies, and he would stick to this argument for years to come. Otis said that the court ruling was fine. He didn't want any contact with the little Sextons.
Yeah, he's like, okay.
Fine, we're still going to carry on.
Yeah, and there's nothing that Eddie Lee can do about Michelle because she's 18.
Yeah. Now, this brotherly feud wasn't something that just kick-started after Michelle came forward. It was ages old. And we wish we could tell you why it all started, but we just don't know.
There is something that happened to those kids. Eddie Lee and Otis, and there's loads of them. Something happened. I just don't know what it is.
But what we do know is that Otis and Eddie Lee Sexton were raised in a coal town in Virginia. They had 8 other siblings. They were dirt poor. But so was everyone else, so they didn't really notice. Having said that, Eddie Lee was his mother's clear favourite. Whilst the other boys had to share Christmas presents, little Eddie Lee always got his own. While the other children were doing chores, Eddie Lee was given cuddles. When he got a bit too big for cuddles, Eddie Lee Sexton robbed a local petrol station. He was caught and served 5 years in prison. During that custodial sentence, Eddie Lee Sexton met the Iceman. Otis Sexton had always maintained that something happened to his brother in that prison that changed him forever and turned him into an abusive sexual deviant. But I don't buy that. I don't think it happens that abruptly with just one single incident. I think we obviously see a build-up here. I think the mother having such a clear favourite is not going to help this kid any. It's definitely going to alienate him from his other 7 siblings. That's going to kickstart all sorts of psychological issues, especially this idea of, like, obviously all parents tell their kids that they're special to them. But it's this feeling of, you are not only special to me, you are special above and beyond all of your siblings and thereby above and beyond all other people in the world. Danger, 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 danger.
There are other things as well from Eddie Lee Sexton's childhood. There's a story from one of his neighbours. So a widow lived on her own, had a lot of cats. And one day all of her cats disappeared. There was like 10 cats. Eddie Lee Sexton, as a child, had stolen them all, cut all of their heads off, hung them from a washing line.
Yeah, that'll do it.
Yeah, that will. Yeah, there was
Signs.
Stuff was bubbling, yeah.
Oh.
I have absolutely no doubt that something happened to Eddie Lee Sexton. I'm pretty sure it happened to Otis as well. It definitely happened to Dave, who's another brother. We'll get to him. It started long before he saw the inside of a prison cell, I think, but I just don't know what it is. There has to be something in that upbringing somewhere. Even prison didn't dull Eddie Lee Sexton's shine in his mum's eyes. The second he got out, she bought him a brand new car. Their father had been a preacher and a coal miner. He died when Otis and Eddie Lee were pretty young. They both claimed black lung pensions for decades afterwards. Following in his father's footsteps, Otis opened his first church, called Burning Bush Revivals. And fresh out of the pen in 1971, Eddie tried to give the bishop thing a go too. He started a storefront church entitled the Calvary Church of God. Otis went down there to support his brother, but he walked out halfway through.
Classic cult leader behaviour.
Absolutely.
Always the path to cultdom is failed preacher to cult leader.
So Otis turned his back upon his brother, and in time, so did everyone else. Eddie Lee Sexton's brief foray into the word of the Lord was over in 6 months. And after that, Eddie Lee Sexton started a little painting business, and Otis would help him out from time to time. But as soon as Eddie Lee Sexton's daughters that were never allowed out of the house started having babies, Otis kept his distance.
Getting back to our story in the 90s, the Sexton children had been in state custody for 24 hours, and the sordid Sexton stories were starting to seep out. Almost all of the Sexton kids admitted to parental naked beatings. Charles confirmed that his mother had scratched and beaten him because she suspected him of sodomizing Lana. Okay, that's his sister, just in case anyone's confused. Now, it's worth mentioning here that Lana, the second youngest, was firmly Eddie Lee Sexton's favourite. Lana was special. Not just to him, but to the world. Sexton would tell anyone that was in his house for more than 2 seconds that Lana had a very unique line on her hand. That wasn't usual palmistry. Sexton claimed that Lana's palm map meant that Lana was a future Tron. She was so powerful that he had to protect her with his life. Because if they found her, they would kill her. Only one person on the face of the planet had the same hand hieroglyphics as little Lana. And that person was, in news that will surprise absolutely nobody, Eddie Lee Sexton himself. He said that the markings meant that he was a warlock capable of wielding unimaginable power and was answerable to no man nor God. Now, you're not likely to forget future Trons, but hold on to them, because you can bet your ass that they'll come back up later. Again, it's the classic, narcissist here that you see with Eddie Lee. He's like, I picked a favourite child, much like his mother did to him. And the reason she's special is because there is something that she shares uniquely with me that none of the others do.
Yes, exactly. And he keeps secrets. This is not one of them. Auntie Teresa goes over when Joel starts seeing Pixie, and he's just out the gate, I'm a Futuretron, and this is Lana, and look at her hand. He will tell anybody the Futuretron stuff.
And I think it also makes it very clear, right, that Eddie Lee Sexton, the things he's saying about Futuretrons sounds nuts, but that he is mentally together enough that he understands that might sound a bit weird and quirky, but you're not going to go to jail for it. But he knows that raping your kids is going to send you to jail pretty quick.
Yeah, it's the bait and switch.
Yeah. He knows what to say out loud and what not to.
For now, let's move on to the next Sexton sibling who was in state custody. Preteen James was determined to be autistic, and he admitted to being made to stand naked beside his brothers, holding encyclopedias with straight arms for hours on end. James was made to sniff the armpits and feet of his sisters. And when he was asked by authorities about sexual abuse, James said, there's a lot of sex in the family.
It's a tricky one, right? Because Eddie Lee Sexton and Estella, they are carrying out all this kind of abuse on their children. And to some extent, to keep them quiet, it's not just fear, but it's a normalization of that, right? So that they never spend time with anybody else, so that they can never figure out that this isn't happening to other children behind closed doors. That's why nobody's allowed over, etc., etc. So then that works when everybody is a captive in the house.
Yeah.
But the minute those children are taken out of the house, they're going to start spilling the beans pretty quickly because they don't know that it's not normal.
Yes and no. I think we've talked before in especially cult episodes, children do seem to have this innate sense of right and wrong. But yes, the other problem that we'll come on to is that children who have suffered DID producing levels of abuse will only talk if they feel like the system can protect them.
And how can any system protect you when your father has drummed into your head that he is more powerful than God?
And also, because the structure of social services, Department of Health Services, blah, 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 their major aim almost all of the time is to keep families together. So getting children out is really hard. The threshold is really high. So sometimes the system fails.
I believe in this country, it is, of course, incredibly high. And also we're talking about a case that, that happened a couple of decades ago. But these days, my belief is the minute there is any accusation of sexual abuse, the children are gone. They're taken away immediately.
But for how long? It's very difficult. It's very difficult. I am fucking glad to not be a social worker. Mm-hmm. James also said that the kids towed the line because they were terrified, yes, but also they were waiting for a payoff. The Sexton children were constantly promised trips to Disneyland if they behaved, and then they were promised the life on the Montana ranch. And if the promises didn't work, then the Sexton kids were regaled with horror stories of the Iceman and what he was capable of. Several of the Sexton children, whilst in care, claimed that their father had tied them up and held a gun to their head.
And a few of them also told one haunting story that you will find, no doubt, very difficult to get out of your head.
But if it has to be in mine, it has to be in yours too, sorry.
So one day, for no particular reason, all of the male children were lined up in the bathroom, whilst their father measured their penises. Michelle was able to reel off the measurements to Wayne Welsh, like they were times tables. Her sibling James also stated that he had seen his sister Pixie beat her own children with a belt. History, it seemed, was repeating itself. And that is where the disclosure stopped. The two youngest girls, Kimberly and Lana, did not breathe a word. For now.
So this is important. This is, obviously harrowing, but good news for Wayne Welsh because the kids are starting to corroborate each other's stories.
And so, as far as Wayne Welsh and the DHS were concerned, they now had multiple statements to support Michelle's. Abuse and emotional maltreatment of the Sexton children at the hands of their parents had been sustained. But there was still a problem. Michelle Sexton, the one who had been brave enough to tip the first domino, was not the most reliable of witnesses. Even Wayne Welsh wasn't totally convinced that she was telling 100% of the truth. But one of Michelle's narratives was easily verifiable. Eddie Lee Sexton claimed disability, and a lot of it.
According to Eddie Lee Sexton himself, he had MS, MD, cancer between his shoulder blades, he was basically blind, and he had debilitating back problems. This is a man who runs a painting company, by the way. He claimed a working man's benefit on top of the black lung pension that he cashed in his dead father's name. Anything you can think of, he's claiming it. And he's claiming other people's as well, fake names, blah, blah, blah. He would also, I haven't included this because it's already so long, but another thing he would do is himself, or usually Willie, he would send one of his sons to befriend someone who perhaps had some sort of mental disability or a physical one, and then they would pressure them into signing over their checks to them. They did that multiple times. All of Eddie Lee Sexton's ailments that he claimed were a farce. There was nothing physically wrong with him. And Michelle told Wayne Welsh, "My dad can move faster than I can. But note, when the police and the DHS come over to his house, he is what? In a wheelchair." Michelle also revealed that while she was in hospital after the first of what would become many suicide attempts, that her brother Eddie Jr. had phoned her and told her to shut her mouth. This is a quote, "I have no respect for you and I will finish you off." Michelle, though, having dealt with the psychological terrorism of her father her whole life, held her nerve. On the 5th of May, Michelle took a polygraph test. And yes, we talk a lot of shit about polygraphs, but in this situation, I'm going to give it a pass because what it did was give Wayne Welsh, Glengoe, the DHS, and the Canton Police Department exactly what they needed. Michelle was squeaky clean. The results of her test concluded no indications of deception, indicating substantial truth. Michelle wasn't looking like such an unreliable witness anymore, and maybe, just maybe, even though polygraphs are bullshit, it would be enough to keep those kids away from Eddie Lee Sexton and out of that compound. Sorry, House.
Meanwhile, we need to catch up with Joel Good. After a period of silence, he, Pixie, and the girls showed up at Teresa's church one Sunday. Pixie was visibly pregnant, again, and Joel told his Auntie Teresa that they were living off benefits and trying to find an apartment, but they weren't planning on staying local. Joel said that they needed to get out of Stark County because the police were after Eddie Lee Sexton. Joel was convinced that everything Michelle was telling the authorities was total bollocks. She just wanted an excuse to get out of the house, and it was tearing the Sexton clan apart. At no point did it dawn on Joel that spinning a fabricated web of incest accusations was quite an extreme thing to do.
Yeah, he doesn't seem... And I really don't want to be unkind about Joel. He's very, very easily led. And Teresa is acutely aware of that. And it doesn't dawn on him that Michelle is an adult. If something wasn't horribly wrong, why would she even feel the need to make up a lie when she could just walk out?
And I think, we said at the start, Joel was a bit of an outsider. He had quite a low IQ. And I think going and spending time at the Sexton family home, because remember, Eddie Lee is fine with him dating his daughter Pixie. Eddie Lee saw him coming a mile away. He knows this is the ideal patsy to bring into the family because he will believe everything I say. And Eddie Lee will no doubt have been incredibly nice to Joel, will have made him feel part of something. And that is, we know, what Joel, who desperately wanted a family, wanted all along.
Yeah, that's why Eddie Lee Sexton was really encouraging of the relationship, because he was like, he's perfect.
Yeah. Now, Pixie had been told that if she didn't take her children out of the house at Caroline Street, that they too would be taken by the DHS. Dawn was 4 now, and she still wasn't talking. And she couldn't recognise colours or even count. And Shasta, her sister, well, she was the same as always, silent and staring. Years later, Joel's Aunt Teresa would learn that the DHS had noticed this behaviour in all of the Sexton children that they had encountered. And they even had a name for it. The Sexton Stare.
Sherry Sexton had a baby by this point as well. Everyone called him Little Bear, and they had already left. Sherry and her baby had gone to live with Eddie Lee Sexton's other brother, Dave, in a trailer in Florida. As for the kids that were still being housed in various foster homes in Canton, Eddie Lee Sexton and Estella Sexton were allowed supervised visitation with them at a state-funded facility, ironically named Harmony House. Yeah.
And look, it's so complicated. This is why social care is so complicated, because it's like the accusations are made. You now must investigate the accusations and figure out what is true. The aim isn't to split and tear families apart if the accusations are coming from somebody who's perhaps not well or acting out for attention or various other reasons. So you obviously want the parents to maintain a relationship with the children while you're discovering whether it's true or not. But when it's true, you're also putting these children directly in the line of fire with people who have been abusing them.
Mm-hmm.
It's so fucked up.
There were loads of unauthorised visitations as well. Eddie Lee Sexton would turn up at his kids' schools. He'd tell the boys that he would buy them cars if they recanted their testimonies. In another flailing attempt to derail court proceedings, Eddie Lee Sexton filed a motion to have the whole thing moved to a tribal court rather than a family one. Eddie Lee Sexton was obsessed with Native American culture. He taught his kids a made-up alphabet, and he told them that it belonged to their tribe. Estella Sexton did have Cherokee heritage, that is a fact. Eddie Lee Sexton certainly did not. Actually, in the early years of their relationship, Sexton called his wife a dirty little Indian. The tribal court motion was denied in July. It had been an endeavour to slow everything down. It didn't work. But the DHS's time to build the case to keep the kids out of the house was running out. And he well fucking knows that. Like, something that people say about him is he's polite, he's clever, can be very complimentary to you, and he knows the law. So he knows that the DHS have 30 days.
So the DHS needed as many statements from the Sexton kids as they could get to bolster Michelle's original story.
Yeah, because they want a slam dunk, right? They want it to be absolutely no question these kids are getting fostered out.
Yeah, because acquiring long-term custody of children is really, really difficult. The DHS needed to prove a pervasive pattern of abuse. And so far, the only one who had made a sexual abuse accusation was Michelle. And getting traumatized children to talk is also incredibly tricky. Hardened social workers will tell you that. To get a child to disclose, they have to truly believe that the system is capable of protecting them. The reality is, sometimes it just can't. Charles Sexton was being held in a juvenile detention centre, and his father would come there to see him all the time. During one of these supervised visits, the pair hatched an escape plan, and they actually pulled it off. Charles ran to the woods behind the detention centre, where Eddie Lee was waiting for him. 1 down, 11 to go.
While all of this was happening, Michelle lived with Uncle Oti for a while, and then she went back to bouncing from sofa to floor to shelter, and she ended up in a psych ward again. There she called Anne Green. And Michelle told Anne that Otis wouldn't let her leave the house or use the phone and that he stole money from her. Yeah, maybe that is true. I don't doubt the elements of that are true. I can see how he's just going to say, I need to know where you are because you're in danger. And that could be interpreted as suffocating. And also, he's her dad's brother. They've got to be similar in some sort of ways. I'm not saying that he was anywhere close to abusing her, but I think she probably equates attempting to keep her safe with, "You are suffocating me."
Absolutely. And again, we can't be 100% sure about this, but Otis taking her money away even could just be a way to keep Michelle under lock and key until this case gets resolved, because it does seem that Otis wants his brother to go down.
Otis absolutely wants Eddie Lee Sexton to go down, and he does play a very big role in how this unfurls. But I think he's hiding something.
Oh, I don't doubt that at all.
I also don't doubt that Michelle lies.
No, and even if she's not lying, right, her being able to freely come and go, have the money that she has. I'm not saying that these are ideal scenarios to be taking somebody's freedom away and taking their money away, etc. But we do know that in cases like this, once somebody has made an accusation, you're waiting for it to go to trial while the investigation is going on. There is a really high incidence rate of people taking their own lives, people going off the rails. And if she does any of those things, her being the cornerstone witness means the case falls apart.
Whilst Michelle was staying at Otis's house, once in the middle of the night a window spontaneously smashed. Michelle was sure that it was a message from her mother, and that message was, "We can find you." While she was in hospital, Michelle was convinced that one of her father's menacing associates was sitting in the waiting room. Could it be the Iceman? Was he there to kill her? We don't know. But it was enough evidence for Michelle that her father had a hit out on her.
Eventually, Anne Green took Michelle into her own home, and things looked up for a while. Michelle even managed to graduate high school. There was no doubt, though, that Michelle was still seriously unwell. She didn't know the most basic aspects of hygiene. Anne clearly cared a lot about Michelle Sexton, but she just couldn't put her own children at risk. So sadly, Michelle had to go. And she went back to Otis and his trailer in Canton. And things remained difficult. She didn't understand why she was expected to be home at a certain time or why she had to do the washing up. One night, when Otis's wife asked her to clean up after dinner, Michelle stormed off, calling her aunt a bitch on the way. That was it for Otis, and he slapped Michelle across the face. Michelle ran out of the house, found the nearest payphone, and called her mother.
Estella told Michelle for the first time ever that she loved her and asked her to please come home.
No, that's the most powerful thing Estella could possibly have said. And she knows it.
She fucking knows. There's a lot of, yes, I'm sure I know Estella was abused also, but she isn't a puppet.
No. I hate this whole narrative of like, oh, well, if this woman's doing it, she's got to be a puppet. Like, it removes all agency from Estella. I'm sorry, they're all her children, right? They're all her children. And she is able to shut off completely that entire part of her brain that is telling her to protect those children.
Estella told Michelle on the phone that Michelle was completely safe. She would even be safe in the Caroline house because Eddie Lee Sexton wasn't there. Estella told Michelle that she was going to divorce him. And so, Michelle decided to go back to 1849 Caroline. And unbelievably, it was a social worker who gave her a lift. Again, if you read House of Secrets, that is explained in more detail. That social worker kind of gives the argument of like, there's only so much you can do. But I don't like it.
No, I don't like it at all, but it's very, very difficult. And to empathise once more with social workers, they have an incredibly unbelievable workload. And if you don't see an end to this situation, you're like, at least I can take her to a house and be like, she's there now. We know where she is.
During the drive across town, Michelle collapsed in the back seat of this social worker's car and she started to convulse. And she was still going when they arrived at the Sexton house. Patrick Sexton looked through the car window and firmly declared that Michelle was faking it. Estella ignored the whole situation and wouldn't stop talking about the weather. An ambulance was called, probably by the social worker, and when Michelle came to, she told the paramedics that her Uncle Otis had hit her and he'd held her against a wall so hard that she'd thrown up.
It wasn't an epileptic seizure. Michelle Sexton had had a severe anxiety attack, brought on by the return to where she had grown up under her father's reign of terror. Still, though, Michelle remained at Caroline Street for a month after this incident. The seller had, of course, lied to her, even though Eddie Lee Sexton was under order of the court not to be. He was at that house on Caroline Street every single night. And while he was in there, the patriarch did what he always did. He knew the whole case hung on Michelle's disclosure, and he was going to break her. He used all his old favourite catchphrases. Girls disappear every day. We put you on this world, we can take you off it. And chillingly, there's a lot of lake out there. Eddie Lee Sexton was living in a Winnebago, just 10 minutes from Caroline Street. And every night he would creep back into the house to work on Michelle. And she didn't have the strength to resist. No one would. Entrapped by her mother's lies, declarations of love, and inhibited by a mind that her father had broken through years of shattering abuse. Eventually, Michelle did what she was told.
Eddie Lee Sexton gave Michelle an attorney office statement, and Michelle copied it out in her own handwriting. It read that she had made the whole thing up. It's a testimony recantation. Can you say that? That sounds wrong.
Yeah. Recant your testimony?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So she recants it, she writes it down, and then she files it in the attorney's office.
And there's nothing they can do because she's an adult.
Mm-hmm. After she filed that bit of paper, the case against Eddie Lee Sexton and the DHS's mission to keep those kids out of that house was in tatters. Charles Sexton was back in Caroline Street after his jailbreak. And because the 30-day time limit had been reached, Kimberly, who was 8 years old, the youngest, and her older brother Christopher were back in there too. Lana, though, the favourite, stayed out. And that's because she told a social worker that her brother Charles had raped her in the bathroom just 2 months before all of the minor Sextons were removed from Caroline Street. When Lana was asked by an agent about her father, her eyes went blank. There it was, the familiar Sexton stare. All Lana said was that she was worried about her brother Charles being in the same house as little Kimberly. And then Lana said something that we haven't heard from any of the Sexton kids yet. That Lucifer was working in that house. Lana didn't have specifics for the DHS, just stories about her father wearing long robes and inverted crosses. But those stories were enough to keep Lana in the foster system and away from 1849 Caroline. And James was kept out too. Just like Lana, he claimed that his brother Charles had raped him. And then there was the Statue of Liberty game. James told the DHS that Charles stood still in the bathroom while Lana and Kimberly, who are 9 and 7 at the time, fellated him at his request.
And they called this the Statue of Liberty game?
Yep.
Okay.
And it is corroborated by other Sextons later on. And with the statements of Lana and James Sexton ringing in the DHS's ears, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Charles Sexton.
The threat of Charles being taken away for a second time caused Eddie Lee Sexton to change up his game plan. He decided he was going to go to the press. But there was something that needed to be done first. The adult Sexton boys, Charles, Willie, and Eddie Lee Jr., boarded up the windows of the house, bought loads and loads of tinned food, put chicken wire up everywhere, and then lined up with a bunch of weapons. Eddie Lee Sexton told his sons and his wife that he was going to force the DHS to give them all of the kids back, and when they did, they would get out of state. Not James, though. Eddie Lee told his other boys that they would leave James in the basement of the house, chained to the ceiling to starve to death, as a punishment for speaking to the authorities. Sexton then rang a local newsroom and told them that his whole family were being harassed by the DHS, and that he was barricaded inside his house in protest, and that he was armed.
Eddie Lee Sexton told the broadcaster that he was ready to kill any worker or policeman that pulled into his drive. He was aiming his gun out of a window as they spoke. The newsroom told the police immediately, but the Stark County PD didn't give Eddie Lee Sexton the shootout he wanted. Instead, officers parked their patrol car a few streets away and called 1849. Estella answered first, but eventually they got the patriarch on the line. His mini Waco plan did not go as he wanted. The news crews never came. The police never approached the house, and not a single shot was fired. All that happened was a very long phone call. After 3 hours of negotiations, an agreement was reached. Kimberly and Christopher Sexton would be allowed to stay in the house for now. And also, a social worker was taken off the case because Eddie Lee didn't like her. He doesn't like her because she's black. He makes a big deal out of it. But Charles Sexton had to go. That was the agreement.
Charles and Eddie Lee Sexton were arrested and taken down to the station, where Sergeant Glengoe was waiting for them. Sexton refused to be interviewed by the law without his attorney present, but he did speak to Channel 5 News. He told the cameras that his kids were being taken away and that he just couldn't stand by and let that happen. When the journalist asked him about the molestation accusations, Eddie Lee Sexton denied them, all with a smile on his face.
The police and the DHS upheld their side of the deal. Kimberly and Jane Sexton were left in that house. In later interviews, their caseworker would say it was the biggest mistake she ever made. Soon, the Sexton children would start to disappear one by one. And to find out where they went, you're going to have to come back next week.
Because it feels like we went through a lot of horrible shit, and just Eddie Lee Sexton being arrested and thrown in prison for the rest of his life at the end of this would have felt like a story in and of itself. But we are barely halfway through.
No. This, if anything, is just setting the scene. There is so much more to come.
Hooray.
See you next week.
Goodbye.
Bye. I'm Hannah.
I'm Shruti.
And welcome to part 2 of our series on Eddie Lee Sexton, which has ruined my life. I am so sad. Can't actually promise I won't cry.
Well, let it all out, if you must.
I won't be able to help it.
We can cope together.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
I finished this off last night in the pub at the end of my road because I can't work from home, and Mabel will just be like, play with me, look at my monkey. And I was in there from about 4:30, and the people at the bar were very concerned about me.
Duh.
Last week, we ended on a bit of a win for Eddie Lee Sexton. Sure, he was arrested for turning his house into a barracks and making threats, but he managed to keep his children, Kimberly and James, in that house with the handless Jesus. And things got even better for him after that. Eddie Lee Sexton was only charged with 2 misdemeanors and got a suspended sentence, which meant he was out in the world and able to keep chipping away at his plan to get all of his children back under his control and then over state lines. That would make the DHS's job and the Canton Police Department's job much more difficult. It was extremely unlikely that the FBI would bother themselves with some family court case. Local press loved the story, naturally, but crucially, because children were involved, almost none of the actual details of the Sexton case were published, which made it really easy for Eddie Lee Sexton to push his own narrative. He was just a persecuted dad trying to keep his family together. And it kind of worked. Sexton managed to garner support from other parents who had found themselves in very similar situations, or so they thought.
He's such a predator, like such a parasitic predator. He manages to once again understand the system well enough that he can infiltrate these well-meaning groups and use them for his own ends.
Absolutely. Parasitic is exactly the right word. He is lots of things. All of them utterly despicable, but dumb is not one.
Oh, absolutely not. So yeah, it all seems mad. So let's take a minute. Social services, as we call them here in the UK, scare a lot of people. On the other hand, we've covered loads of cases on this show that reveal the truth to be the exact opposite.
I have actually personally been told when I was younger, if social services ever come to your house, you do not let them in that door because they will never leave.
That's not really what was happening here. So let's put that idea aside. For this case, location is really important. We are in the Bible Belt in the early 90s. The satanic panic had only just started to wind down, and people were more aware than ever of false accusations of child abuse ruining adult lives. Teachers were imprisoned based on memory regression testimony. It was the perfect time for Eddie Lee Sexton to bang on about being wrongfully accused. Because false imprisonment was far more present in the public consciousness than it had ever been before. On top of that, Eddie Lee Sexton was a Christian man. He could quote scripture with the best of them. So getting conservative locals with a mistrust of the law on side was pretty easy.
But he didn't get everyone. The rumours were still whispered in Canton. One babysitter even told a story of being in 1849 Caroline Street with all of the children when a thunderstorm broke. The kids ran outside as soon as it started. They huddled together and stared up at the angry sky, getting soaked by the pregnant rain. When the babysitter asked the young ones what they were doing, they said, "Jesus is coming. He's coming to take us away." But Jesus never would. A day or so after the failed blockade on Caroline Street, Joel Good's aunt, Teresa, saw the not-so-siege on the news while she was out shopping. Her stomach dropped. She knew now more than ever that Joel needed to get away from that family, but she just didn't know how to make it happen.
You just feel so helpless.
Yeah. And what's really interesting about that is Teresa actively avoided the news. It was only because she happened to be in a shop that was showing it that she saw it. Given Joel's low IQ, which was 80, and yes, IQ tests do have problems, but that's not now. Teresa thought about having him declared as an incompetent and taking him home with her. Teresa had made her sister, Joel's mother, a promise as she lay dying. She promised that she would look after her sons after she was gone. But even though getting Joel away from the Sextons was all Teresa wanted in the whole world, she didn't feel like declaring her nephew incompetent was keeping that promise.
So as Teresa agonized, she walked back to her car and saw two young men approaching her. Her heart sank as she realized that one of them was Willie Sexton. At first she didn't recognize the much smaller guy by his side, but as they got closer she did. It was Joel. Not only was he hunched and painfully thin, Joel was black and blue. Willie Sexton said that Joel had been beaten up by their cousins for calling one of them a gimp. Joel insisted that he was all right. But Teresa, of course, didn't believe a word of it. He was clearly not all right, and the Joel she knew would never have said that about anyone anyway.
A few days later, Joel showed up at his grandparents' house in hysterical tears, clutching a note in his hands. He had walked 12 miles in the pouring rain after Pixie Sexton had thrown him out of the car. Littered with spelling mistakes, grammatical errors, and plus signs instead of the word and, the crumpled note read, "Joel, what I want for Christmas is for you to leave me and the girls to start our life over, and you go your way. Then maybe my family can get along without you. Right now, no one can do and say anything, you being there. Our marriage is over anyway, which it has been for the past 2 months. Me and you don't get along, and neither does the girls. About the baby, you can see it if you want, but as far as raising it, I will raise it. I will raise it with the girls myself, and whatever you do, don't try anything. Or your family better not try anything, because I have already talked to Dad, and his people said, any trouble, just call them and they will help me. Love, Pixie."
I love that. Love Pixie.
Honestly. Joel's whole world had been ripped from him.
Because Joel was certain that he was the biological father of Pixie's unborn baby. And Joel already knew that he loved that baby more than life itself. So he was broken. But Joel filed for divorce the next day. Although it was horrible to see him so distraught, Joel's family were relieved. They had their boy back. Joel's family had always had their suspicions about the Sextons. They'd heard the rumours. Everyone had. And when the sexual abuse accusations came to light, concern and disapproval turned into disgust and rage. Teresa had a horrible feeling that even though Pixie had dumped him, the Sextons weren't done with her Joel. And as always, Teresa was right.
Soon enough, Pixie was back in Canton and Joel went to meet his estranged wife at the mall. After about an hour, Joel called his Auntie Teresa and said, "Will you hate me if I go back with Pixie?"
Oh, Joel.
I know. Teresa had no idea what back meant. Did he mean 1849 Caroline Street? Or one of these campsites that kept calling her about litter, noise and overstaying bookings? But she didn't ask. Teresa just told her nephew, "We love you, we're just worried." Teresa had a horrible feeling that Joel's life was in danger. Before the call ended, Teresa told her nephew, "Don't you ever leave and not tell me again. They will kill you next time." After he hung up the phone, Joel Good went back to 1849 Caroline Street with Pixie.
Not long after, Pixie gave birth to her third baby, a boy this time, and she and Joel named him Skipper Lee. Skipper was the nickname that Pixie's older brother Charles went by. We warned you last week about the endless names, and it is very much a continuing theme this week.
Yeah, so everyone calls Charles Skipper. We're going to call him Charles because the baby is Skipper. It's so confusing.
But Charles, who is Skipper, actually referred to little Skipper Lee as his godson.
Yeah.
Cool. So Joel and Pixie brought the new baby to visit Aunt Teresa a few weeks after Pixie gave birth. Skipper Lee was a healthy, active baby, and he did actually look exactly like Joel. And, as fate would have it, was even born on Joel's birthday.
As fate would have it is such a good phrase for the rest of this episode. There are so many things that will just give you chills.
But there was something off about Skipper Lee. The baby smelled odd. Teresa couldn't put her finger on what it was. If she had asked social worker Wayne Welsh, he would have told her that it was the stench of neglect. The very same smell that clung to the walls of 1849 Caroline Street.
In 1992, Skipper Lee's namesake, Charles Sexton, was shipped off to stay with Estella's brother, that's his mum, who was called Tucker, and his wife, who's called Colleen. They didn't live in Ohio, they lived near Charleston in West Virginia. Tucker had never been an enormous fan of Eddie Lee Sexton. He watched the light drain from his sister's eyes throughout her marriage to him. Still, though, Tucker and Colleen were happy to take Charles in. Presumably, they didn't know about the accusation of incestual abuse that was being filed against him back in Ohio. Charles got on all right in West Virginia. He was helpful and polite, but just like Michelle Sexton, he had his difficulties. And just like his sister, they started at night. Colleen and Tucker would hear their nephew speaking really loudly in his sleep. When Colleen crept up into the spare bedroom to see what was going on, Charles was sat upright in bed, screaming the words, "Stop it," over and over again.
No, thank you. No, thank you.
He's in his early 20s at this point.
Yeah, I have another particular fear of people screaming in their sleep. When we were in Cuba, Hannah, you did enjoy the first night we were there screaming, he's here in your sleep. And I was like, fuck, shut the fuck up. Oh my God.
I'm a terrible sleep talker. I haven't walked in years.
Don't fuck.
There was a particular episode in Panama where I was there with my boyfriend at the time and I walked into another man's bed and slept there. That was very difficult to explain. Oh, it was Nicaragua, actually. I beg your pardon. Anyway, back to Charles. Sorry, we're going to get through it. Charles's eyes, as he screamed in his sleep, were glazed in total terror. It seemed that the Sexton stare haunted those who grew up in 1849 Caroline Street, even in their dreams. While he was awake, though, Charles never gave anything away. Apart from once. When he was watching a documentary on the occult with his aunt and uncle, he said, "My dad killed a cat once." But that was it. Colleen and Tucker didn't get the chance to push Charles any further. Soon the sheriff's department found him.
Before they managed to arrest him, though, Charles was collected by a couple of his brothers and he disappeared. Eddie Lee Sexton, Estella, Michelle, Charles, Willie, Eddie Lee Jr., Christopher, and Kimberly all made their way to a campsite on the Ohio River called Bushman's Lake, over the state line in Indiana. It was a calculated move that would make it even more difficult for law enforcement to catch up with them. Again, a very unfortunate fact that Eddie Lee Sexton knew all too well. Joel, Pixie, Dawn, Shasta, and new addition baby Skipper Lee met them there. And all 13 of them lived in a 2-bedroom trailer. And in that trailer, the rules all changed.
Joel Good was the butt of every joke and the receiver of every punch. But because he was still desperate for approval from his demonic de facto father figure, Joel just took it. Estella found a new lease of life too, a renewed spark in her marriage. And we know this because Estella wrote her husband, Eddie Lee Sexton, a bunch of love notes. And they said things like, "I will love you after death and come back and cut something off you if you end up with someone else."
Jesus Christ.
Estella, I don't spend too much time on her reasoning in this episode because I just can't be fucking bothered. She, of course, later claims that she had no choice. She's fucking in on the whole thing, man. Anyway, another one of these love notes to her husband revealed that Estella was pregnant. But no baby ever appeared. Not from Estella, anyway. At Bushman's Lake, Eddie Lee Sexton was preparing for another siege. He dressed all of his sons in army fatigues, except Willie, who Estella called Little Dick. Sexton ran drills with his boys at all hours of the night. He taught them hand-to-hand combat, hunting, how to break a nose with the heel of their hands, and how to garrote someone. Even little Kimberly could break down a gun for cleaning by the age of 10.
Eddie Lee Sexton said that he had learned all of this stuff he was now teaching the kids in the army. And the most intense stuff? Well, he had used that to survive in Vietnam. But that's just what Eddie Lee Sexton said, because he was never in Vietnam. He was never even in the armed forces. But the Sextons didn't know that.
Where he was in fucking prison.
Yeah. Joel, though, was left out of all of the pretend Green Beret games entirely. The Sexton boys beat him up regularly. And he was quite literally the camp punching bag. Whatever she would claim later on, Estella clearly did know what was going on with Pixie and her husband. And she was mad with jealousy. Screaming arguments could be heard coming from their bedroom on a daily basis. And Estella would openly call her daughter Pixie a whore, and flat out refuse to hold little Skipper Lee, and would barely look at Dawn or Shasta.
Pixie and Eddie Lee Sexton were not hiding their twisted relationship anymore, and another horrible game emerged. The kisses game. This involved Pixie and her father passing Hershey's chocolate kisses to each other with their mouths in front of everyone, but especially in front of Joel. Every 2 weeks, Pixie, Willie and their father would drive back to Ohio to collect all of Eddie Lee Sexton's various fraudulent disability checks. On at least one of these trips, Pixie and her father went at it under a blanket on the back seat as Willie drove on the interstate. When they weren't incesting away on the car cushions, Pixie and Eddie Lee Sexton would talk about Joel Good. Pixie was sick of him, she said, and Willie suggested they put a life insurance policy on Joel and then take him out.
Bingo. I could have predicted this is where this was heading.
Initially, Eddie Lee Sexton told Willie that he was crazy. Still, though, the seed was sown and it would germinate over the next few weeks, and I do think that it's probably a seed that Eddie Lee Sexton gave to Willie. Willie is not a person who comes up with his own ideas, as we will go on to find out.
Back in the real world, another officer of the law had been assigned to the Sexton case. Stark County Sheriff Detective Steve Reedy.
It's written ready. I wish it was ready. I'm Detective Ready.
Yeah.
But it's not, I'm afraid. I'm sorry.
And Steve Reedy, as ready as he might have been, was stuck. The detective had been approached by Eddie Lee Sexton Jr. over some money that his father had stolen from him. Although this change of heart wouldn't last too long, Steve Reedy wasn't giving up. He was sure that Eddie Lee Sexton had skipped the state. The FBI were no good either, because as it stood, the Sexton case was a custody matter. And because Michelle had recanted her statements, the FBI wouldn't waste their time on what, on paper, just looked like a family court proceeding. It was a tough spot to be in. And even now, Steve Reedy racks his brains trying to think of what he could have done differently. He told Lowell Caufle, author of House of Secrets, quote, "Maybe if I'd done more, some people would still be alive."
Like every official that we've come across, Steve Reedy knows about the fucking Sextons. They're all in the same spot, though. They don't have anything they can get him with. And then Eddie Lee Jr. shows up and he's like, right, fraud, we can get him. And that's why he pushes so hard. Soon enough, though, Detective Reedy would have a little bit more to work with. Eddie Lee Sexton's favourite child, Lana Sexton, the Futuretron, had started talking. By this stage in our story, Lana was in her 8th foster home. And due to her behaviour, it was very obvious to the DHS that Lana was a victim of extensive sexual and physical abuse. And soon, the ritualistic element of her torture would come to light. To her new foster parents, Tabitha and Ted Fisher, Lana Sexton seemed to be a contradiction in terms. She was mature and juvenile all at once. She spoke to adults as if they were her peers, but also played with Barbies 24/7 and used the word penis in every other sentence. Things took a turn when Lana's brother Charles turned up in her playground and told Lana that he would be back with their father.
After that, Lana thought she saw Eddie Lee Sexton everywhere. And who knows, maybe she did.
Because he definitely did go to the kids' schools. He definitely did stalk them, essentially.
But Lana's new foster parents tried to reassure her that she was safe. But Lana told them, "You don't understand. There is nothing he can't know. He can talk with us anywhere. He's Satan. He has special powers." Trying to understand, Tabitha started a kind of ritual of her own with Lana, but a positive one. Every evening just before bed, Tabitha would sit with Lana in her lap and they would talk. And during these sessions, Lana told Tabitha things that her new foster mother couldn't even imagine, let alone totally believe.
Tabitha and Ted have never fostered a child before.
Oh, wow. I thought the way that reads is like people who are very experienced in fostering incredibly troubled children.
No, they had 20 hours of training.
Oh, wow. I mean, some people, I guess, just have it innately in them.
Yeah, they went into it. They couldn't have children themselves. They're very young also. They went into it because they couldn't naturally have their own children, and they were like, we want to help the ones who really need it.
I'm so glad that there are bright spots of people like Tabitha and Ted in this story that is otherwise relentlessly crushing.
And the time has come to revisit the Futuretrons that we talked about last week. The tall tale that Eddie Lee Sexton would quite openly discuss with his house guests at 1849 Caroline Street. Like a lot of things in the Sexton hellscape, the Futuretrons were a commercial endeavour. Sexton often spoke about a multi-million-dollar deal that he had made with Burger King and Wendy's.
Fuck's sake.
To sell his and Lana's image as a marketing ploy. What I understand from the totally indecipherable ramblings of an incestuous pedo madman is the following. Sexton and Lana would dress up in superhero costumes and appear at various fast food outlets as a publicity stunt, like the Hamburglar and Ronald McDonald, but in space or on steroids. So he tells people, he's like, if he owes someone money or like whatever, he's like, oh no, it's coming. I've just done this deal with Burger King and Wendy's and we're going to be the new face of them, basically, is what he says.
Of course. That makes total sense.
Lana showed Tabitha the mark on her hand that made her a Futuretron. Lana and her father had even travelled to New York and Florida to have meetings with people about the Futuretrons. Although Lana didn't go to these meetings, her father took a lot of photographs of her with him, and I don't even want to think about where those images ended up.
Lana also often told Tabitha about being dressed up in white and dancing around by candlelight as her father watched. She also heard stories that were nothing short of body horror. Lana showed Tabitha a large scar at the base of her spine. She said that she had actually been born with a conjoined twin sister. According to Lana, her father had separated the two of them when they were born and killed the other one. And Lana whispered to her foster mother, "That could have been me." Lana also reconfirmed Charles raping her in the bathroom that day, and also her father hitting her mother in the stomach. But her explanation was beyond belief, because she said it was so that the baby would die, and I had to drink its blood. Tabitha asked if Lana had ever seen the baby, and Lana said that she had. Chopped up on a tray.
After only a few weeks in the Fishers' house, Lana became convinced that her father knew that she was talking about him and what he had done. Tabitha would hear Lana talking late into the night, and when she asked her who she was speaking to, Lana said, "I'm talking to the voices." Night after night, Tabitha would find Lana crammed between the wall and her chest of drawers, crying, "I'm not allowed to tell. He wants me. He told me he wants me. He is Satan." It's worth putting in here how, before we go on, that the Fishers were extremely Christian, and I do think that has some bearing on what happens next. The Fishers felt like something dark had descended upon their house, and no amount of praying seemed to shift it. Lana's night terrors continued. She would see her father standing at the end of her bed, and one night she stared out of the window, mesmerised by a phantom of her grandmother, the owner of the handless Jesus statue, standing in a bloody white dress. Grandmother Sexton was saying to Lana, "Come with me." Some nights Lana would writhe and convulse as if she was being pummeled by an unseen force, screaming, "He's killing me."
That was the last straw. The Fishers went to the police, and Lana underwent a medical examination, and the evidence was undeniable. Lana Sexton had been penetrated. She agreed to testify. Steve Reedy headed a task force and started to get everything collected for a grand jury indictment against Eddie Lee Sexton. They had never had tangible evidence of sexual abuse like this before. This was their shot. But as the case was built in the sheriff's department, things were getting worse under the Fishers' roof. One night just before Halloween, after Lana had been put to bed, she started making a strange whining sound that her foster mother Tabitha had never heard before. When Tabitha went upstairs, Lana launched at her, kicking and screaming, as Tabitha wrestled her foster daughter to the mattress. Lana bellowed in a deep voice, "You're not getting her. You're not taking her. She's mine." Then Lana spoke in her normal voice, saying, "Help me, Mummy. I gotta go, Mummy. He's got my throat." Then the deep voice was back, saying, "Fuck Jesus." Lana then spat in Tabitha's face, saying, "I love you, but you know too much, and I'm going to have to kill you and then myself." The Fishers took Lana to a psychiatric ward on the 18th of October. Oh my God.
I mean, it's DID, that's what's happening. Because, we've looked over it before. It is between the ages of 7 and 9 that when that sustained abuse happens to you, that's when it happens. It's a really specific thing, and that's why it's so rare. And that's exactly what Lana's been through.
Fucking hell. It is terrifying. And I'm not a religious person, but I can honestly say if that was happening, I don't know that I wouldn't believe she was actually possessed.
And I think that's genuinely what they did believe. But fucking good on them for taking her to hospital and not a priest.
Absolutely.
When they dropped Lana off at the psych ward, they found out that another Sexton was already there. Lana's slightly older brother James had been taken into the same hospital after a series of psychotic episodes. And remember those chills I warned you about, they're coming. The two of them had the same dreams and the same flashbacks on the same nights. Some have speculated that these traumatized children had been triggered by the impending doom of the approaching Halloween, but I'm not so sure. The day before the underage Sexton children had been taken into custody of the DHS, their father told them, "If you talk, I will see you in your dreams."
It's almost like, I know we talked about this on the MK Ultra episode. It's almost like he's created little Manchurian candidates.
Exactly.
That once, I mean, you know, some people may think it's DID, whatever. I know some people still disagree with that as a diagnosis. We don't know. We're not psychiatrists. But it almost feels like he's conditioned them to the point that if they are ever in the outside world being questioned and too much stress and pressure is being put on them, that they just mentally collapse, because that's how he's created them. And it is staggering. A man like this, again, I know he's not stupid, but having had this amount of immense power and having been able to get away with it for so long, despite the fact that everybody knowing what he was like.
But I genuinely think that's what the Futuretron thing is about.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason he says that to everybody who walks in his door is they're like, fucking hell, he's nuts. It's the bait and switch, is what I said last week.
Yeah.
Like, don't look at this. Look at me pretending that I'm the Hamburglar in space.
Solana and James were the only Sextons left in the foster system. Matthew had run away and been picked up by his brothers and taken to the Bush Lake campsite in Indiana. In their cramped and squalid conditions and run ragged by military-style drills in preparation for an FBI raid that was obviously never going to come, the Sexton camp was restless. The patriarch was becoming more and more paranoid. Not a single child went to school. And worried about noise drawing attention to the fact that there were way more people in that motorhome than there should be, the adults started to drug the children to make them sleep. Again, all his tactics are like he's such a wannabe cult leader, but he's like too lazy to look outside his own family, if that's the right word.
He doesn't want outsiders.
No,
that's the
true.
thing. That's why he has so many fucking children.
Yeah, because even the whole dressing up in white and dancing, it's very like
Children of God.
It's very like the Children of God. And also very much like that Australian cult we covered, The Family. And then you have this obsession that Eddie Lee Sexton has with the FBI raiding him. It's like he is projecting his future of the end of his quote-unquote cult with the likes of Ruby Ridge and Waco.
Yeah.
That's the level he thinks he is at.
Completely.
And I think that really speaks to his narcissism and sense of grandiosity.
And so does the bit you're going to say next.
Yeah, because Eddie Lee Sexton kept reminding his children and his wife that he was the chosen one, by pointing, again, to the Futuretron mark on his hand and telling them all the time, "I am destined for the life in the hereafter." The ground surrounding their motorhome was littered with crude pentagrams, and someone even uncovered a cassette tape under their camp full of satanic chants.
Perhaps some demonic force told Eddie Lee Sexton that he was losing his grip. He decided to move everyone on. More state lines were put behind the Sexton clan and they moved way down south to Florida. The Sextons that didn't fit into the malevolent motorhome left Indiana in a car with a bumper sticker that read, "God, guns and guts made America. Let's keep all three." That's another thing he really plays on, is like, I'm an American. My rights are being violated. Because that appeals to fucking Bible Belt Americans.
Yeah, and again, he is not a stupid man. He understands that after you have an incredible scandal like the Satanic Panic situation, where teachers were being imprisoned, parents were being imprisoned for crimes that had clearly never ever happened, it's like he knows, A, go big or go home. Go so big that anybody who makes these accusations against you is going to sound nuts.
Yes.
Also say nuts things, so if anybody looks at you, they just think you're crazy. And so he understands with the Satanic Panic, the pendulum has swung the other way. So he just needs to really, really double down and dig his heels into the fact that the state, the government is trying to take my rights away. They're turning my children against me. They're trying to take my children away from me. He understands that that is in the consciousness of the public at this point, and he manipulates it once again very successfully for his own ends.
Absolutely. He does not believe he is the devil.
No, and he keeps going on about America and freedoms and rights. I'm like, well, the law in America is that you can't rape your fucking kids. So obviously it's all just a ruse, a ploy under which he uses to manipulate everybody's perception of him. And it is so shockingly successful for such a long time.
Only Michelle Sexton stayed behind. The rest of them headed to Pasco County, Florida, famous for mosquitoes, the KKK, and also the home of Eddie Lee Sexton's brother Dave. Dave was the one who took Sherry Sexton and her son in after Wayne Welsh paid the Caroline Street house a visit months before. It was in the Sunshine State that Eddie Lee Sexton decided he was once more going to attempt to move things along. The press hadn't worked, so this time he resolved to go all the way to the top. Embodying Walter White, Sexton recorded a 3-hour and 9-minute videotape. He told the camera that his constitutional rights were being violated, his children were being abused in foster homes, and it was all because his daughter Michelle and his brother Otis had hatched a conspiracy to bring him down. Once this mammoth production was wrapped, on her father's orders, Pixie Sexton posted copies to the President of the United States of America, William Jefferson Clinton, and to the Attorney General.
All right, time for some good news. Because on the 20th of September, the DHS was awarded permanent custody of all of the minor Sexton children.
Which, as I said last week, is so hard to do.
Yeah. Steve Reedy was thrilled. But in order to pin this fucker for good, Steve had a long way to go. Social worker Wayne Welsh was ready to help, and he tracked down Michelle Sexton one more time. By this point, Michelle was married, but she was miserable. She still agreed, however, to give another statement. She redacted her recantation and added more stories from inside the walls of 1849 Caroline Street. And I know I said it was some good news, and it kind of was a bit before, but brace yourself. Because this is what Michelle said. Once when she had refused to perform oral sex on her father, he had knocked her into a coffee table, chipping her tooth. Eddie Lee Sexton had held wedding ceremonies for Lana and Kimberly. The girls were dressed in white and taken up to their parents' bedroom for what Sexton called their honeymoon.
Eddie Lee Sexton's mother is something to do with this, because he's her favourite, that's very obvious. She's the one that appears to Lana, and the Jesus statue is hers. He only brings it back to the house after she dies. I don't know what it is, but it's something to do with her.
She sexually abused him. I'm putting it out there. Like, that's what happened.
And now I've got some actual good news. Lana's testimony, her medical examination, and Michelle's turn to the light meant that the grand jury indictment against Eddie Lee Sexton for rape and sexual abuse went through. Eddie Lee Sexton was now wanted for 4 counts of rape and 4 counts of sexual imposition. And the FBI, having received the Patriot paedophile tapes from the Oval Office, were ready to throw their hats into the ring as well. The Bureau actually managed to get hold of Estella Sexton and told her that they should hand themselves in. If they didn't, a federal warrant for their arrest would be issued. And did Estella hand herself in? Did she absolutely fuck? She rings them and she's like, yeah, we'll hand ourselves in. Oh, actually, it's raining. We're not going to come. She does a lot of stuff like that. She had no intention of handing either of them in. She was far too busy writing love notes to her hellish husband on the road. Soon the Sextons had landed in a campsite in the cute-sounding Little Manatee State Park. But absolutely zero cute things were happening.
Money and resources were low, and Eddie Lee was away quite a lot of the time.
Collecting those checks.
Yeah, so the mice started playing hard. Pixie and her brothers were off their nuts almost constantly. Boozing, huffing petrol, doing any drugs they could find, stealing, and setting shit on fire. But most of all, they made Joel Good's life a living hell. He was beaten almost constantly. When they got bored of that, the Sexton siblings went hostile on him. Now, we're not going to tell you everything. We just don't have the time, but here are some snippets. Joel was made to swallow a goldfish whole and sodomized with a funnel as hot sauce was poured into his intestines. Later on, everyone would blame everyone else for these atrocities. But our ringleader money is squarely on Pixie Sexton.
Absolutely. None of them deny that these things happened. They're all just saying, oh, it was them, it was me, blah, blah, blah. Like, no one takes responsibility. I fucking know in my heart it was Pixie Sexton.
So while all this was going on, baby Skipper Lee, because yes, remember, there is a baby there while all this is happening, barely crossed his mother's mind. And then when he got poorly in early October 1993, Pixie just fed him NyQuil until he fell asleep. He was pale, cold, and listless.
He is a baby.
Skipper Lee was not even 1 year old, and he went from sleeping 17 hours a day to not sleeping ever at all. And one night, as the various Sextons were crammed into their motorhome hovels, baby Skipper Lee was screaming up a storm. Pixie kept giving him more and more NyQuil, but the little baby boy wouldn't stop.
There are a lot of versions of what happened next. Just like with the Joel torture, there's a lot of buck passing and a lot of denial. So I've decided the best thing to do is to give you the iteration of events that I believe. As Skipper Lee was bawling his ill baby eyes out, Pixie heard her father's voice coming from the room he shared with Estella saying, "Shut that baby up or I will." In response, Pixie slapped her baby across the face twice, once with the palm of her hand and one backhand, something she did often. It usually shocked Skipper Lee out of crying, but not this time. So, mother of three Pixie Sexton put her hand over her baby son's mouth until he stopped crying, and then Pixie Sexton went back to sleep. When the morning came, Pixie was the one screaming. Just one word, over and over. Dead. In case you don't have a head for dates, I'm going to tell you something. Lana and James Sexton had been taken from entirely different living situations into the same psych ward back in Ohio the night Skipper Lee died. Whether you believe in that sort of stuff or not, that one's quite difficult to shake.
When he heard Pixie's screams, Charles Sexton, the baby's namesake, pulled the mucus from Skipper Lee's mouth and attempted to revive him with crude CPR. But it was far too late. Baby Skipper Lee had already changed colour. Joel Good looked on in horror as Eddie Lee Sexton emerged from his marital bed, totally calm, and told everyone that a hospital visit or official funeral was completely out of the question. They would just bury Skipper Lee's body in Little Manatee State Park. It was SIDS, Sexton said. There was nothing they could have done. It's sad, but it happens all the time. So Pixie dressed the tiny body that was already cracking with rigor mortis, and then she put her baby, that she had smothered to death, in a duffel bag. And all she had to say for herself was, "It just died."
It. She always refers to Skipper Lee as it.
The duffel bag was weighed down with a brick and sunk in a peat bog within the park. The only thing baby Skipper Lee took with him into the next world was a single red rose in a black plastic tube. Wherever he went, we can only hope that it is better than the few months he spent on Earth.
Joel Good was inconsolable. He kept asking, why does it have to be me? Why does it have to be my son? He thought that, at the very least, his baby deserved a proper burial. Eddie Lee Sexton turned to his son Willie, his loyal henchman, and said, "If he keeps this up, we're going to have to take him out." And before we go on, a note on Willie. Obviously, Pixie has gone through unimaginable abuse. I do not have a scrap of sympathy for her. Willie Sexton is the only one I feel bad about. I feel sorry for him. He is so developmentally handicapped. I'm going to give you an example that I can't stop thinking about. When he's questioned by police, right, they ask him where Joel lives. And he says, I think with his grandparents, but I don't know if it's his grandparents or his brothers. He doesn't understand that brothers have the same grandparents. He's a big guy, like Eddie Lee Sexton uses him because he's big, but I think he was diagnosed with the developmental ability of an 11-year-old, and he's in his 20s. So that is who we're dealing with. A week and a bit after Skipper Lee died, the day before Halloween 1993, Joel Good decided he was going to take things into his own hands. He and Pixie went to the Manatee County Public Library searching for information. It was Willie Sexton who drove them there. The librarian on duty that day was Gail Novak. And the picture you have in your head of an early 90s librarian is totally correct, apart from she's not old, she's young. Pixie and Joel asked Gail where they could find information on SIDS. Joel was barely intelligible and Pixie looked like she hadn't slept in days. But Gail still pointed them in the right direction. As Gail pulled the references, Pixie kept repeating a few sentences. Kind of like a story, but disjointed and odd, like she was learning lines or perhaps trying to convince herself of something. Pixie kept saying, "We are camping, we had a baby, it died. It's the second baby I've lost this fall. The old man is the father, we have a baby in the car."
Gail had no idea what to make of this exceedingly odd couple, so she kept her distance, but a watchful eye. While in the library, Joel used the payphone in the hall twice. First he called the campsite, and then he called someone about a headstone. When he returned, Joel told Pixie that he was going back to Ohio to give Skipper Lee a real funeral. When Gail Novak heard this, she thought, "My God, there is a dead baby." So she rang security and told them, "There are people here with a dead baby." But security were having none of it, and they actually threatened Gail with a fine for bothering them with a stupid prank and hung up. She's a librarian, she's not a teenage boy. Why would she be prank calling you?
I think they think the students are pranking her and she's too stupid to figure out what it is.
I see.
Eddie Lee Sexton had, of course, been in hot pursuit. He showed up about 30 minutes after the rest of them and asked Gail for books on Native Americans. As she showed him where they were, Eddie Lee Sexton stood uncomfortably close to Gail. He also dismissed the books that Gail Novak recommended to him as being the wrong kind of Indian. He says something like, "No, I want the Boy Scout ones, the ones with names like running and jumping." And then he turned his attention to Willie Sexton, who had just ambled in. And Gail heard Sexton tell his son, "The grave is ready for tonight." Gail watched as Sexton, who she called the old man in her police interviews, go back to his truck, where he pulled out a machete and a shovel. Gail couldn't quite see what the man was doing, but it looked like he was digging next to his truck. Then he pulled a bundled shawl from the bed of his pickup. Gail made her way over to Pixie and slipped her a battered woman flyer. Pixie looked at her and said that she had to have sex with a man at the campsite, and when she came back, the baby was dead. Eddie Lee Sexton, back from his digging, rushed over to Pixie and slammed her head into a computer table, shouting, "You better get your story straight." Willie tried to explain to his father that Joel was going back to Ohio. Eddie Lee Sexton hissed back at him, "The only way he's going back to Ohio is in a body locker." Another military reference means body bag that Eddie Lee Sexton probably stole from Good Morning Vietnam. Gail Novak watched as they all left her library. She was too scared to call security again. But she wouldn't forget the inebriated man, the battered woman, the violent older man obsessed with Native Americans, the digging, or the bundled shawl anytime soon.
Now, what we're about to tell you next is another one of those parts of this case that has been told many times by many people in many different ways. We are going to tell you the most likely turn of events. Back at the campsite, Willie asked Joel to go for a walk in the woods with him. Once they were out of everyone's sightline, Willie grabbed Joel from behind and wrapped a length of twine with twigs wrapped around either end around Joel's throat, just like his dad had shown him. Joel fell to the ground and let out a loud yell, the last sound he ever made. There were a few minutes of struggle, and then Joel Good went limp. Willie, in his own words, went all paranoid. and tried to give Joel CPR to make him come back alive. Then Eddie Lee Sexton made his way to the woods with a shovel. There was a picnic at the Sexton campsite that night. Blood relatives only, no outsiders. Eddie Lee Sexton told his family that Joel had been picked up by his Aunt Teresa in a red Nissan, and that he was going back to Ohio for good, so they didn't need to worry about him anymore.
Joel wasn't in Ohio, of course. Joel Good never left Manatee State Park. But in Ohio, things were moving along. Detective Steve Reedy had received a tip. Yet another one of Eddie Lee Sexton's brothers rang Steve Reedy to say that Eddie Lee, Willie and Pixie Sexton had paid him a visit quite recently. And while they were there, Eddie Lee Sexton had made 2 phone calls, and Orville Sexton, who is this brother, had the presence of mind to hold on to his phone bill. Detective Steve Reedy was over to Orville Sexton's house like a shot. The first call that Eddie Lee Sexton had made had been to his brother Dave Sexton, the one who lived in Florida, and the second call had been to Little Manatee State Park. It was the bullseye that Reedy had been waiting for. Detective Steve Reedy had no idea that anyone had died, let alone a baby. But Teresa, her funny feelings were back. She was standing with her family in her kitchen on Thanksgiving, and she said out loud, "I think Joel is not with us anymore."
The FBI moved into the Floridian camp in surveillance vans and arranged daily reconnaissance flyovers. The Sextons needed to be kept in the dark until the Bureau could make their move. And in the dark they certainly were. The Sextons had actually been keeping quite busy since they eliminated any foreign DNA from their motorhomes. Eddie Lee Sexton had a new target, an elderly retiree called Ray Hesser. He had made his money, sold his company, bought a shiny new Winnebago, and now he was ready to see the world. And Ray's wanderlust had brought him, unfortunately, to Little Manatee. And the Sextons saw him a mile off and hatched a plan. Willie would befriend Hesser. Pixie would seduce him, and then they would kill him, steal his money, steal his identity and his shiny Winnebago, and drive off into the sunset.
The 14th of January 1994 was the day that they, in Eddie Lee Sexton's own words, pull it down. But Ray Hesser knew something was off. He told the strange siblings that he would meet them at a different campsite later that afternoon. He waited until Pixie and Willie were out of sight, and then Ray Hesser drove squarely in the other direction. I will point out, so Pixie's the one that goes and pays for the campsite, right? She goes to the office every week and she gives them the cash. And the people who work there are like, she was pretty, but she fucking stank. And she's like all over Ray Hessler, who's just trying to enjoy his retirement.
She's also nuts.
That too.
Yeah.
But, you know.
1 out of 3.
Yeah.
That same afternoon, Eddie Lee Sexton, Estella, Pixie, Kimberly, and Christopher were all in the car heading to Sun City to pick up some shopping. At 1:36, they pulled into the car park of a supermarket, but before they could get out, the car doors were flung open by the FBI, and all of the adults were arrested. Kimberly and Christopher were taken back to Ohio and put into care. The Sextons, back at Little Manatee, were brought in for questioning. Sherry Sexton, although now an adult and mother, still had that Sexton stare, and she admitted that her father had sexually abused her since she was 13. She also agreed to a blood test for her son, Little Bear. Blood was taken from Dawn and Shasta too, and Charles Sexton admitted that he had once sodomized little Lana and confirmed all sorts of other horrors that went down in 1849 Caroline Street. When the Sextons were asked where Joel Good was, every single one of them, children included, said that he had gone back to Ohio and that a woman in a red Nissan had picked him up.
I do think that some of them genuinely didn't know.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm sure. I believe it. Because otherwise, why not just tell them? He lies to them for a reason because he knows he can.
After these interviews were concluded, Detective Steve Reedy went straight to Teresa, because she was Joel's closest relative back in Canton. He asked her if she had any idea what red Nissan the Sextons might be talking about. Teresa was stumped at first, but then it dawned on her. They were talking about her. They meant her. But Teresa never had a Nissan. She had a red Mazda, quite a similar looking car, but it had been totaled ages ago. The dam was well and truly cracked. The red Nissan never existed. So the pickup story just could not be true. Steve Reedy started to think that Teresa was right. Joel Good wasn't missing. He was dead. And Steve Reedy was going to find him. Presented with this revelation, Charles Sexton, in his 20s, after prolonged questioning, eventually snapped. He not only confirmed that Willie had murdered Joel, he told Steve Reedy about baby Skipper Lee. And he said that he could show Steve Reedy where both of them were buried. Which he obviously does because he wants immunity, because he's admitted to the rape of Lana. And also, Lana's confirmed it, Michelle's confirmed it. A bunch of the other Sextons have told the same story. So this is not noble of Charles. He's saving his own arse. Steve Reedy called the sheriffs down in Florida the next day, and sooner than he could blink, Charles Sexton was on the first plane journey of his life.
Detective Steve Reedy was nervous. This was an expensive mission. If it was all for nothing, it would be his neck on the line. His mind racing, he turned to Charles Sexton and told him, "I've never lied to you, and I won't. But if you're making this up, I'm going to kick your ass."
He is so worried.
Yeah. So when the pair of them got to Little Manatee, hordes of police were already there. Charles Sexton headed into the woods with the K9 unit.
Yeah, Reedy doesn't go with him because they don't want to crowd the scent. So it's just Charles and the K9 unit that go.
Yeah, meanwhile, Reedy paced in anticipation, sure that it would all come to nothing. And then a thumbs up came from one of the dog handlers. In a peat bog, the dogs had uncovered a red rose in a black plastic tube. This wasn't just a sexual assault case anymore. This was a double homicide.
Willie Sexton was the first on the grilling list. Authorities found him hiding in Dave Sexton's motorhome, and Steve Reedy compared the interview that I'm going to tell you about to talking to an 8-year-old. Willie Sexton couldn't count back from 20, and he had absolutely no concept of the trouble he was in. He's the only major player, as I said, that I have any sympathy for. And also, because he doesn't understand, it also means he's a lot less likely to lie. And I really don't think he did. Willie confirmed that Pixie had killed her baby and that he had buried Skipper Lee's body with his father, and they both checked the site for rotting corpse smell for the next 7 days. They needn't have worried. Peat is an astonishingly good preservative. Admitting to the murder of Joel Good did take Willie a bit longer, but in time he did, and he said it was all Pixie's idea.
In her interview, Pixie was totally deadpan. Her eyes were dead. It was like there was no one there at all. They gave the Sexton clan another name in the DHS office. The Flatliners.
Yeah.
When it came to baby Skipper Lee, Pixie confessed that she had given him NyQuil. But she said she did not intentionally smother him.
I would say 85% of me thinks that is true. I'm not sure that she intentionally smothered him, but I just don't think it matters.
Yeah, I don't think she intentionally did it, but when Skipper Lee died, I don't think she cared.
Nah.
Pixie denied any knowledge of Joel's murder. All she said was that she heard Joel's cry from the woods and went to see what was going on. And that was when she saw Willie strangling Joel.
Back at the camp, the plastic-encased rose was all that had been found. Charles Sexton had failed to deliver the goods, so Willie Sexton was taken down there, and he very quickly showed the police the correct spot. Joel Good's body was hidden in the peat bog. I'm not going to say buried because it was just 3 inches below the surface, and the twine garrote was still around his neck. Baby Skipper Lee was found very close by, entombed in the duffel bag. His dummy was still in his mouth. Interestingly, though, Skipper Lee's toxicology report showed that there was no alcohol in his system, which doesn't match the NyQuil story. NyQuil has alcohol in it. And if he is being dosed so consistently and so often over such a long period of time, which is what everyone says, even Pixie herself, why isn't it there? We don't know. We'll never know. It's just a thought experiment. Joel Good's blood, though, absolutely brimming with alcohol. Skipper Lee's cause of death was determined to be suffocation, and both of them, father and son, were buried in Canton, next to Joel's own parents. Skipper Lee was laid to rest, cradled in Joel's arms.
Finally, the authorities had what they needed. It was go time. Of course, the trial of Eddie Lee Sexton is the big one. He called it that himself. But the DHS, the police, the sheriff's office, and now the big boys at the FBI had to make the most bulletproof case they could. So they got all of the other trials they could out of the way first. Every conviction strengthening their narrative. Estella Sexton was sentenced to 6 years in prison in October that year for evading a federal arrest warrant. Her husband was interviewed shortly after, where he compared himself to Jesus.
Big surprise.
For he too, apparently, was condemned to death for something he had never done. In 1996, Estella was put on trial again, this time for the whole sexual abuse shebang, based on testimony from her own children. She was charged with 31 counts of rape, complicity to rape, child endangerment, and gross sexual imposition. Estella's only argument was that she was so terrified of Eddie Lee Sexton that she had no other choice. But we're not having it, and neither were the jury. And Estella Sexton got life. She died in 2017 after 23 years in prison. Until the day she died, Estella sang the same old tune, though. Walk a mile in my shoes, and then you'll understand. I don't want to put your shoes on, Estella, because I'm going to get verrucas, warts, trench foot, gangrene, and I'll go insane because you are... She just is the perfect reflection of Eddie Lee Sexton because, again, she does all of the minimizing. She shifts the blame. She blames him for everything. She takes absolutely zero responsibility or shows any remorse for anything she did to her own children.
Yeah, and I took this out because if you want to read all of the testimonies that happen at Estella's trial, all of the trials, they're in House of Secrets. She was doing it too, independently, and there's pages of testimony. Next stop in Operation Clear the Decks before the big one was Pixie Sexton. Pixie presented a particular problem for the long arm of the law. They needed her to testify against her father at the big one, but she'd also killed her own baby. Accident or not, offering Pixie immunity in return for a court testimony was out of the question. But without her, there was every possibility that Eddie Lee Sexton could walk. Even a plea deal was really, really pushing it, especially when you consider that if Joel Good had never met Pixie Sexton, he would still be alive. Imagine being Steve Reedy and having to go to Joel's family saying, Pixie's got a plea deal. I am so sorry. Eventually, a plea deal is what happened. Pixie did go to prison, but for the lesser charge of manslaughter in the case of Skipper Lee. She was paroled after 2 years. No one came to pick her up from prison.
When the blood results came back for the next Sexton generation, the speculation that Canton residents had shared between themselves for decades was finally proved to be true. Dawn, Shasta, and Little Bear were all fathered by their own grandfather, Eddie Lee Sexton. The body of little Skipper Lee was never tested for paternity. What was the point of forcing Joel Good to suffer another indignity?
So that is why Sherry Sexton gets sent off with Little Bear when Wayne Welsh shows up. Because Eddie Lee Sexton's like, they're going to test that baby.
Yeah, absolutely.
Get it to Florida, get it out of Ohio.
Yeah. And as if this wasn't all horrible enough, the worst was still to come. Because Dawn and Shasta, who were just little girls at this point, were examined. And it was confirmed that they had both been penetrated anally. and judging by their almost non-existent control of their bowels, it was happening a lot. Evidently, depravity ran between brothers too. Dave Sexton, the brother who lived in Florida, who Sherry had lived with, was the exact same. His grandson was also his son. Perhaps that's what the Futuretrons were about, creating a totally pure bloodline. Ptolemy style.
Deep breaths, everybody. In custody. This is the bit that I might cry. In custody, Willie claimed that his father had been sodomizing him regularly since he was 9, and it had continued all the way up until Little Manatee State Park. It was so obvious that Willie was terrified of his father, his defense managed to pass a motion that father and son be tried separately. Under psychiatric observation, Willie was diagnosed with depression, psychosis, and PTSD. He heard voices talking about Joel and he had seizures. Willie didn't understand the concept of a plea deal or even how being imprisoned worked. He called his Uncle Otis from Hillsborough County Jail and asked, "Uncle Otis, will you be able to take me home?" God. In the end, it was decided that Willie Sexton had the functional capacity of an 11-year-old. He was not insane, but he wasn't competent enough to stand trial. He was sent to a psychiatric hospital where he was assessed every 6 months.
When the big one finally came, in October 1994, Eddie Lee Sexton rolled into the deposition for the murder of Joel Good in a wheelchair, wearing sunglasses. The prosecution were quietly confident. They had managed to get a guilty verdict on the conspiracy to murder Ray Hessler for Sexton. And it had been an encouraging dry run. Sexton changed his plea after the first witness and got 30 years.
Yeah, that's the only reason I included Ray Hessler, is that he's quite an important peg in the web.
And the prosecution had another race up their sleeve. The defence's argument was simple. Otis had cooked the whole incest thing up. Pixie had never had sex with any of the family members. Sherry and Willie had sex with each other all the time. And Eddie Lee had nothing to do with any of that or to do with the murder of Joel Good. Willie and Pixie had planned and executed the murder of Joel Good to cover up their roles in the death of baby Skipper Lee. But almost every single Sexton child that grew up in 1849 Caroline took the stand for the prosecution. And all in all, there were 27 witnesses.
Eddie Lee Sexton had 2 witnesses compared to these 27, his sister Jean, who I'm not even going to bother with, and Eddie Lee Jr., who had changed his allegiances once again. He'd spent the run-up to the trial making threatening phone calls through his brothers and his sisters, asking, "Are you with us or against us?" When Pixie took the stand, she spoke so quietly that the mic had to be adjusted several times, and she told her story all over again, adding that she'd heard her mother and her father discussing how they were going to kill Joel because he knew too much. And she closed her statement with, "I hate my father for what he did to me."
More Sextons came and more Sextons went. They didn't say anything we didn't already know. But if you want to get into the minutiae of this trial, we would highly recommend reading the book House of Secrets. The prosecutor had a bunch of witnesses, but the flatliners were just not that convincing. A lot of them gave confused witness statements. They mixed up dates and times and contradicted themselves. And this was a death penalty case, so the stakes couldn't have been any higher. But then came the ace. An incredibly nervous librarian, Gail Novak. Not even the FBI knew of her involvement in the case. Gail came forward herself.
Fucking love Gail.
Yeah.
On the stand, Gail told her story of that day before Halloween the year before. But she was so anxious, she sounded quite paranoid. And no one could make any sense of the digging out in the car park either. The defence thought that they had Gail pinned. There was no way that Pixie Sexton would reveal so much information about dead babies to a stranger, they argued. Detective Steve Reedy was worried. The authorities had been sweating bullets about the Sexton siblings' believability in court. But perhaps Gail Novak had been the least believable witness of all. The jury deliberated for 2 hours and 35 minutes. It was squeaky bum time. Steve Reedy and co. were sure that the jurors had totally disregarded the state's case. But they hadn't. In the case of the murder of Joel Good, Eddie Lee Sexton was found guilty in the first degree. And even better than that, it was Gail Novak that swung it for the jury. She was the only witness at that trial that was not a family member. She wasn't emotionally involved. She had no reason to lie.
But there was still one more step. The jury had to deliberate again. Did Eddie Lee Sexton deserve a life sentence, or did he deserve death? Which, because he was being tried in Florida, meant the electric chair. 2 hours later, the jury were back with a vote of 7-6. Eddie Lee Sexton was headed for the chair.
Yeah, it's one vote. If it had been 6-6, he would have got life.
His sister Jean told the press on her way out, "If everything you heard is true, Estella should be sitting on his lap."
Steve Reedy, Wayne Welsh, Glenn Goe, and anyone else that had been involved over the years let go a huge sigh of relief. For them, it might have been over. But for the people who grew up in that house on Caroline Street, the torment would never end. 2 years later, in 1997, Willie Sexton was tried for the murder of Joel Good. He claimed that his father had held a gun to his head and forced him to kill Joel. And who knows, maybe he did. Charles Sexton was never charged with anything. Eddie Jr. took himself into a police station one day wanting to be sectioned. They said no, and he went to prison for armed robbery in 1996 and served 12 years. When James Sexton was 25, he burned his roommate to death as he slept on the couch. At trial, James Sexton claimed that he thought he was burning his dad. Sherry Sexton miscarried twins after testifying at trial and was hospitalised with depression several times. Little Bear was taken into care. Pixie's children were also taken from her, and she developed severe anorexia and never stopped hearing her father's voice. We have no idea where those children ended up.
In 1997, Eddie Lee Sexton won an appeal on the basis that he was on trial for murder and not for sexual abuse. And of course, all of the testimonies that came from his children had talked about the sexual abuse, and he claimed that this had inflamed the jury. And unbelievably, the man who had been convicted of Manson-esque mind control was indeed granted a brand new trial.
The fact that they managed to get him for first degree when he didn't actually do the murder is extremely impressive. But, yeah.
Also dangerous.
Yes, quite.
So this time round, Willie Sexton testified against his father and accepted a sentence of 25 years for murder in the second degree. And this second jury came to the same conclusion as the first. Guilty again, and death again. Upon his sentencing, Eddie Lee Sexton turned to his attorney and said, "That's life." But Eddie Lee Sexton never met old Sparky because he died in his cell in 2000 from heart disease. I'm sure everyone listening has a lot of questions. We do too. Firstly, why? Why the incest? Why the sexual abuse? Why the satanic rituals? The most obvious place to go is Eddie Lee Sexton had an insatiable need for control. But we also think it's more than that. Something happened in that cold town in Virginia, and probably for generations before that. But what exactly the Sexton secret is, we'll never know.
Lowell Caufle makes a really good point in the book. He's just like, I want to know who was the first one that said it was okay. Interestingly, though, incest, especially in Ohio, as I learned, is a lot more common than we want to believe. The Kinsey report documented that 1 in 100 women had had sexual contact with their own fathers, and that kind of abuse was much more rampant in impoverished homes. And incest is all over the Old Testament as well. According to Leviticus, the only people who are off-limits sexually are your in-laws. And don't get me started on Lot's daughters, because I'll be here all day.
Now the second question, is one that I asked in episode 1. Why were some daughters allowed to bear children, whereas others had their babies beaten out of them? Well, it's not good news. Several Sexton children, mainly James, Lana, and Michelle, gave accounts of unborn fetuses being chopped up, placed on a baking tray, and eaten by the family for dinner. According to James Sexton, unborn babies taste so much like chicken that for the rest of his life he couldn't eat poultry. James and Michelle and even Willie all had stories about miscarried fetuses being buried wherever the Sextons went. So maybe Pixie was telling the truth when she told librarian Gail Novak that they had a baby in the car with them. We have it in writing that Estella was claiming to be pregnant at Little Manatee Park, but no baby ever appeared. Perhaps that was what was bundled in the shawl that Eddie Lee Sexton buried next to his truck that day. After all, the shawl would be a very odd thing for Gail to lie about.
We mentioned all the way back at the top of the show last week, where I was a different person, that all the Sexton children were very close in age. In her first 5 years with Eddie Lee Sexton, Estella gave birth every year. And then the age gaps got bigger. And then, at the age of 37, Estella Sexton stopped having babies. Why did she stop? She was evidently fertile and certainly still of childbearing age. Or maybe the real question we will all be thinking about tonight when we can't sleep is, did Estella stop having babies? How many more Sexton fetuses are buried out there? All over Ohio, Indiana, Florida, and who knows where else. According to James Sexton, one of the unborn babies lies outside 1849 Caroline Street, right under the statue of Christ, the handless statue. James's father would often tell him if he misbehaved, he would sleep in the ground with the dead baby. In the Gospel according to Luke, as the King of the Jews died on the cross at Calvary, the sun darkened and the temple of Jerusalem ripped apart. With his last breath, the Saviour of man cried, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." But at 1849 Caroline Street, Stark County, Ohio, God had no hands to give. Which, look, the Sexton children, I don't doubt that some of the things they say might not be true. Abused children do lie, etc.
Their sense of reality is also totally warped.
Quite. I can't explain the shawl. I don't know why Gail Novak would lie about that. And the pattern of Estella's pregnancies is questionable. And if we believe Michelle, Sherry at least once miscarried because she was kicked.
Yeah. And as for all the stuff with them talking about the newborn babies on trays being baked and eating them, I don't know if I believe it, but I also could believe that Eddie Lee Sexton just chopped up a chicken, put it on a tray, put it in the oven and told his children that they were eating babies.
Oh, me too.
I really feel like with Eddie Lee Sexton, it screams of a man who, like we said, the context of the time is very important. It's immediately after the Satanic Panic. He will have been watching all of that. He will have been absorbing all of the stories that came out of it. It feels to me like a man who became obsessed with the Satanic Panic, the perverse, diabolical, demonic accusations that were coming out of that, mixed together with this obsession, this grandiose obsession he has with cults and cult leaders and the going out in a blaze of glory with the FBI raiding you, etc. And then chuck in God knows how many generations of trauma, incest and sexual abuse, and God knows what happened to him, presumably at the hands of his mother. And that seems to be where we get to with him.
Yes, absolutely. I don't even have the words. But I do think that is the best ending I've ever written.
Very good. Well done.
Thank you.
It was very good. So that's it, guys. That is the two-parter on Eddie Lee Sexton to wrap up our midway point for the month of October because the next 2 weeks will be coming to you with our story swaps. So we will see you then. For some more horrible shit, probably.
Bye.
Bye.